Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Sweetman, and I am the director of the British School at Athens. Welcome to the BSA. And for those unfamiliar with us, we're a UK-based charity whose object is to conduct, facilitate, and promote research in Greece in all periods and across all arts, humanities, social science disciplines. We do this from a main base in Athens and a smaller satellite research centre at Knossos, which of course is on Crete. And at the moment, you're looking at a screenshot of our website, which I urge you to visit to explore what we do, and also to consider signing up to receive information about our activities, including future events like this, and perhaps to become one of our growing group of supporters. So, it's a great pleasure to be able to host this evening's event. But before I hand over to Gonda, a few protocols that will, I hope, help the event run smoothly. Other than the panelists and myself as host, all microphones are off by default. Throughout the talk, two features are available. There's a chat feature that looks like a single speech bubble that allows you to type text, which can be read by other participants, as well as the lecturer and host. You can use this if you experience an issue, and my co-host, Kate Smith, will try to assist. Otherwise, we'll ignore comments in the chat, but feel free to comment to each other during the talks and, of course, throughout the discussion. A Q&A feature that looks like two speech bubbles, one on top of the other, into which you can type questions for the speaker. Only you, the speaker, and the host can see these. After the lecture finishes, the chair will read out a selection of questions received, and our speaker will respond. You should see a small window in the top right of your screen, and if this gets in our way, you can mouse over it and either move it around your screen, or you can click on the bars just above it to make it smaller. Now, I hope that's all clear, and we'll repeat the protocol, the question and answer protocol after our speakers have presented. And it's now over to Gonda, and I'm very grateful to her for chairing this event, and thank you very much to all the speakers for being here as well. Thank you. Over to you, Gonda.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to do this together. Hello from London, everyone. My name is Gonda van Steen, and I'm the Courage Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at King's. So I already built, it's a great pleasure to be building on what happened last week, a very wonderful session, very beautifully led by my former colleague, David Ricks, with three speakers who put out the big chunk topics of pain in translation, trauma in translation, or as Victoria Solomonidou phrased it so beautifully, solace through translation. So we have our blueprint ready from last week, and we're going to proceed accordingly this week with three new speakers. The first one will be Natasha Lemos, the second one, Dimitris Tsiovas, and the third one, Maria Nikolopoulou. But before I go into introductions of the speaker, let me first say a few things about this series and the general topic. It's been a great pleasure, actually, to build on a tradition of translation-related panels that we have been organizing in collaboration with the British School at Athens. I inherited the series from my predecessor, Professor Roderick Beaton, and Rebecca inherited the series from her predecessor, John Bennett. Each year, typically around this time of the year, we do these online sessions on translation. They're open to everyone, anywhere in the world, and they're beautifully recorded as well. Translation is always key, but we try to kind of, let's say, make the subtitle of the session related to current events. And of course, building on the memory and the activity related to the commemoration of 1922 and now also 1923, the topic could not be more apt. Literature in the aftermath of the 1922 Asia Minor catastrophe, this time with a focus on reception. So I'm very grateful to the British School at Athens for being such a staunch partner in this production, but also to Aris Laskaratos from Aiora Press, who brought out these absolutely beautiful and timely volumes related to the anniversary. So I very much want you to know how much I appreciate that we have his help as well. And of course, the technical support of Kate Smith and of the British School is unparalleled. So tonight then, let me introduce our speakers. Our speakers will speak consecutively without us interfering and with all of us saving our questions till the end. I will introduce them and then we go straight on to the talks, which are each about 10 to 12 minutes. Speakers will have a PowerPoint or not, but most of them do. And then we save our discussion topics and our questions to the very end. And at the very, very end, I give our speakers also the opportunity to leave us with a final thought. So then, our first speaker is Anastasia Lemos, who prefers to go by Natasha and is a very dear friend. She is a visiting research fellow at King's College London. She is also a very stalwart supporter of everything Greek in the London community, being a fellow trustee of the Anglo-Hellenic League, for instance. She did her PhD work at SOAS on a topic that could not be more appropriate, on the literature of Greece and Turkey, inspired by the war of 1919 through 22 and the population exchange. Tonight, her topic will be early literature of the Asia Minor disasters, 3 themes for consideration. Indeed, as I said, our topic is reception. So we focus on what work has been produced, which versions have survived, how did versions grow with time, how have versions of literary work intersected with testimonial narrative, with archival research, but also what has been silenced, what is still too painful to tell. What, for instance, of the aftermath of the refugee experience hasn't quite penetrated public memory? These are kind of the big themes that our speakers will tackle. Our second speaker then is Dimitris Tsiovas, who hardly needs an introduction. He is Professor Emeritus of Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham. I could mention very many books, but I will on this occasion only single out his last book, an award-winning book, Greece from Junta to Crisis, Modernization, Transition, and Diversity. I also want to thank Dimitris for being such a welcoming and always very giving colleague in the UK world of modern Greek studies, which I've had the benefit of enjoying. Now, Dimitris' talk will be Nostalgia and Trauma, from testimonial to archival narratives on the Asia Minor disaster. And then last but not least, Maria Nicolopoulou is a King's alumna. She is currently on the laboratory and teaching staff of the Department of Philology at the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. But she was also recently a fellow in the Comparative Cultural Studies section of Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies in Greece. Her interests lie in the post-war avant-garde, in periodicals and intellectual thinking, in the reception of women's writing, but most appropriate for tonight, the role of literature in the construction of the memory of historical events. And her talk will be questioning the national narrative, the role of prose fiction in the memory of the Asia Minor campaign. Very last item then, I want to mention the exhibition that David Ricks also mentioned, The Epic of Anatolia at the American School. Subtitle is The Asia Minor Catastrophe in the Greek Imagination. I want to give it special emphasis because Natasha Lemos has been co-curating it. So lots going on, but let me now pass on to our first speaker, Natasha Lemos. Natasha, the screen and the floor are yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonda. Thank you very much. Thank you also, Kate, for assisting me so much. and thanks the British School for hosting the event. I would also like to express my thanks to Natalia Vogeikov-Brogan, who's the main curator of the exhibition you mentioned, Gonda, and for making promptly available to me material from the archives. Do I share screen now?
Coming in.
Yes. I'm going to focus on number 31328, henceforth the number by Venezis. This is, as probably many in the audience know, the narration of the author's horrifying experience in the Turkish labor battalions after the end of the Greco-Turkish War. In publishing terms, this book has been a great success, at least by Greek standards, as you can see on the slide. What is the reason for this relative success, given that there are earlier works which have passed into complete oblivion? One reason is that this work is actually rather good and was immediately after its publication in book form in 1931 recognized as such by a very broad range of critics from all sides of the political divide. Just to mention a few of the names who praised it: Mirivilis, Rodas, Papatsonis, Kordatos, Petros Charis, Fotos Politis, Kostas Varnalis, Telos Agras, and Achilleas Kyrou. But this isn't the entire story. Looking at the publishing history, by far the greater volume of sales has come in the post-war period and continues to flow. So there must be something that appeals to contemporary readers and not just to the critics of the 1930s. Another phenomenon that we have to account for is that some of the forgotten works are also quite good. One of them, From Captivity, according to the diary of the captive Herman Vita Kappa, is in fact the very first example of the captivity prose narrative. It appeared in 1923, was reprinted in 1924, and then completely disappeared for 80 years. In his standard works of 1977, Doulis mentioned it, but takes it to be a genuine diary. It has since turned out to be a work of fiction by Marcos Avgeris. Here is an additional little proof in the form of an autograph dedication currently on show at the Gennadios. It seems that Avgeris has disowned this book for ideological reasons. A striking side of this is that amazingly, Doulis thanks Avgeris in his preface, but Avgeris has not deigned to inform him that he had authored this work. As the reprint of 1924 suggests, the book could have had an afterlife with the author's support. Without it, it was easy for the book to disappear in a time when print runs and the reading public were small. A universal theme that runs through the reviewing response to the number is that the narrative speaks for itself and that it lacks any sentimentality. In fact, one reservation that appears in left-wing criticism is that the narrative is too matter-of-fact and does not delve into deeper social causes. Here, we should note that the version we now read was the result of a very conscious effort of self-translation, to use the term from last week, by Venezis himself. The number had a prehistory in a serialized version that appeared in Mirivilis' Mytilene newspaper Campana in 1924, immediately after Venezis' return from captivity. This reads quite differently in style and in linguistic register from the book. The language is also a maiari, very hard demotic, and in striking contrast to the snappy, almost sarcastic at times manner of the book, the serialized version is very pensive and ruminative. If you can see the first line, the opening line, the famous opening line of the of the book form of 1931, is nowhere to be seen in the first installment in Campana on the left. What made Venezis change this? It was his response to the sparse and matter-of-fact Doukas' A Prisoner Story of 1999, which Venezis reviewed in Tachydromos of Mytilene. I quote, "Mr. Doukas was not detained as a prisoner. I lived through that. With his subtle sensibility, he grasped a life which he had not lived. I made an attempt of things I had endured. it is worth affirming with unfeigned joy, Lucas's work as a whole is indisputably superior to my attempts. The book edition of 1931 was not the end of the matter. Venezis made minor changes to a second edition of 1945 and afterwards to a third of 1952. What can we say about these subsequent changes? A general tendency is that the work becomes more national in sentiment. A glaring example is the omission from all the book versions of a horrifying tale retold in the serialized version by a captive who had been in the Greek army. Not only had he sacked the ruined village they were now passing through, but he had also burned a Turkish girl alive. The book versions do include references to Greek atrocities, but in general in much vaguer terms. Another instance is the reworking of a scene where a collection of priests is bundled into a cellar with the captives. Between 1924 and 1952, the image of priesthood is upgraded in stages from the contemptible to the merely pitiable. I am tempted to conjecture, in the absence of any documentary evidence, that the toning down of controversial material between 1924 and 1931 may have had something to do with the unsuccessful, as they turned out, prosecutions of Venezis under the so-called Ivionimo, a law passed by the Venizelos government in 1929 to suppress subversion chiefly aimed at the communists. Prosecutions of this kind were a serious threat to Venezis' precarious livelihood as an employee of the Bank of Greece. Let me add here that even in its relatively sanitized version, the number was banned in the Metaxas years and during the German occupation. It may also not have helped that in his review of the book, Asimakis Panselinos had patronizingly called Venezis almost a Marxist. The most distinct final touch to the book, as it is read today, was in the addition in the 1952 version of epigraphs to each chapter from the Psalms. These are carefully chosen to epitomize the ensuing narrative. The general idea seems to be to represent the narrator as God's faithful suffering servant. I'm not so sure that this fits very well with the flippancy and sarcasm that is otherwise preserved in the book. Before I go on to mention its foreign reception, I will make a guess about why the book has remained a success in more recent times. I think this is not only due to its literary merit, but also to the way that it flatters the self-image of the readership. The victim, who is one of us, is entirely innocent. It matters that he is a civilian rather than a military prisoner of war, another difference with the work of Avieris that I mentioned, and distinguishes it from the run of memoirs by military men. The narrator is also broad-minded enough to admit that some sins were committed by our side, also to acknowledge the bravery of the Turks who resisted and the occasional kindness from them. So overall, despite the horrors in the narration, readers may find it something of a feel-good novel. The book did get a foreign review as early as 1932 by Louis Roussel. It was translated into French in 1945 and into Italian and Portuguese in 1947. Translations into other languages, not of course English, followed much later. The Italian translation prompted the interest of a young man who subsequently became a big figure in Neo-Hellenic studies, the Constantinopolitan Levantine Mario Vitti. He attempted a comparative study of To Numero with Yaban, an emblematic Turkish novel of 1932 by the famous writer Yakup Kadri Karaosmanoglu, set in the War of Independence, as the Greco-Turkish War is known in Turkey. Vitti's comparative study was intended for publication in the periodical Oriente Nuovo, but because of political sensitivity, the editor wanted changes which Vitti could not accept and gave up. Nonetheless, Italian interest in the number continued, and a comparison of the serialized version and the book form was published in 1978 by Ines Di Salvo of the University of Palermo, where Vitti also taught. This is very hard to find, but there is a copy in the Gennadios library. Finally, I will touch on the fate of number 31328 in Turkey. Both, here is the Salvos book, both the author and the book were banned for many years. However, unlike Venezis, who never returned to his native Ayvali, a Turkish translation did finally make its appearance in 2015 in spite of the ban. I do not know how wide a circulation the translation achieved. It cannot now be seen in the publisher's online catalog, but copies are still for sale on Amazon and similar sites. Let me close with Venezis' opening and closing lines. 1922, η Ανατολή γλίτατη πάντα για σονέτο κάτι τέτοιο. As you can see, Venezis uses a very artful framing device for the entirety of the narrative. It works in Greek because of the multiple meanings of the word Anatoli, Don, the East, as well as Anatolia. Anatoli is the first word of the novel. At the end, as the freed captives head west to Greece, they see dawn breaking in the east, but a dawn that turns into flame, the flame that destroyed their former life. In Turkish, the treble meaning of Anatoli is impossible to capture. The translator has chosen the word Anadolu, which is no more than a geographical term, and so the artistic effect of the original does not come across. Despite its apparent simplicity, the book number 31328 is not so easy to translate. Thank you. I have stopped screen sharing. Stop share.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this event and Honda Van Steen for the introduction. I will not focus on any particular novel in my talk, but I'll offer a general overview of the literary production from the 1930s to the present day. I hope you can see my PowerPoint, and I use the titles in order to, because I mentioned a number of titles, it's easier for you to see the titles on the screen, just in case you miss some of them. I'll start with a general observation that although there was considerable Greek literary activity in Asia Minor, particularly in Smyrna, Trebizond, before 1922, none of the texts produced there had any lasting impact on modern Greek literature, while some texts written after 1922 became central to the Greek literary canon. There are broadly two kinds of narrative on 1932 and its aftermath. The nostalgic novels about lost homelands and testimonial accounts on captivity and refugee experience. My talk will focus on these two kinds of narrative and how recent novels have transcended this earlier pattern by moving away from testimonial accounts to archival research and focusing on the earlier peaceful coexistence of Greeks and Turks, or acknowledging the atrocities on both sides. The first category includes novels which express a temporal nostalgia for childhood, coupled with spatial nostalgia for the land left behind. Characteristic examples are the novels Leonis 1940 by George Stotokas, chiefly set in Constantinople between 1914 and 1922, Aeolian Land or Land Aeolia in 1943 by Elias Venezis, mostly set in Ayvali in 1914, while most of the action at Hadjifrangu 1963 by Kosmas Politis takes place in Smyrna in 1901-1902. In these three novels, there is much quaint and exotic detail that serves to distinguish the world of the lost homeland from the implicitly drugged, mundane existence lived by the characters in modern Athens. In Leonis, the picturesque world of the Taksim Gardens and the colorful parade of the Allied armies testify to the cosmopolitanism of the novel, In Aeolian land, the author stresses the exoticism of Anatolia, particularly when seen from the viewpoint of Doris, a newcomer from Scotland. He also makes an explicit contrast between the Anatolian Greeks, who share the same taste with their Turkish neighbors, and the family of westernized Athenians into which Doris is married. In each case, however, the myth is shattered by history, and the seamless timelessness is violated and supplanted by the fragmenting and corrupting process of time. Theotokos cannot avoid talking about history as the fate of his generation and nostalgia for lost worlds and another time. I quote from his note at the end of the novel. I felt myself in the grip of an intense nostalgia for the years of the First Great War, the Armistice, and the Asia Minor campaign, a nostalgia for lost worlds and great historical moments, imbued with the sweetness and bitterness of childhood and teenage memories, but without my being able to tell whether it was really a nostalgia for childhood or puberty or something like an old ailment, which one day resurfaces under the influence of a change in atmospheric conditions. Venezis also dreamt of the Aeolia, where he had lived his childhood and attempted to recall its sounds, sights, smells, and tastes. His novel represents the culmination of the process of mythologization of Asia Minor as a locus amoenus in Greek fiction, representing a mythical world being destroyed by history. In Hadjifrangu, time is handled in a more complex manner as is characteristic of Politis. He seeks refuge in his childhood memories in order to escape from his sense of being a subject alien, or Rayas, as he tells us, in his own country, where he feels he is persecuted for his political beliefs. In short, all three novels conjure up memories of a largely happy past, which is embellished by being filtered through an idealizing memory. Asia Minor became a mental construct and a space for the projection of fantasies, desires, and nostalgia. Svetlana Boyle distinguishes two types of nostalgia, the restorative and the reflective. The first tends to be more collective, seeking to restore lost places or monuments, whereas the latter puts the emphasis on the individual algos and melancholy over the ruins of the past. The restorative nostalgia represents the desire for the return to the national past, with the reflective focusing more on the individual cultural memory. The novels mentioned earlier move between these two types of nostalgia, combining the individual nostalgia and the collective trauma. A different kind of nostalgia involves the extension of the time frame of the narratives and the emphasis on the earlier peaceful coexistence of Christians and Muslims or Greeks and Turks. A characteristic example is the novel Farewell Anatolia in 1962 by Vidos Sotiriou. The Greek title is Matomena Homata, where the peaceful cohabitation of Greeks and Turks and the love between Endavier and Manolis is contrasted to the labor brigades, the Amile Tambourou, and the hatred inflamed by the war. Sotiriou's commitment to the left determines the main point of the novel, that Greek and Turkish nationalism was stirred up by the European powers and foreign capital and turned friendly people into violent fanatics. Social class for Sotiriou is more important than race and religion. Asia Minor as a nostalgic construct that exists in the memory and imagination of the Greeks could also be traced in more recent narratives, such as the award-winning graphic novel Aibali, published in 2014 by Solou, which is a pseudonym of Nikolopoulos, which has been translated in a number of languages, Turkish, French, English, and Spanish. Though the starting point of the book is a nostalgic visit to Aibali and the ancestral roots of the narrator, based on texts by Kondoglu Venezis and Agati Venezi Moliviati, the novel highlights the narrative of a second-generation Turco-Cretan Ahmet Yurolmaz and the uprooting of the Muslims from Crete. The meeting of the narrator with a Turk of Cretan origin in Ivali facilitates the acknowledgement of the pain of both sides and the fact that both are, according to the narrator, grandsons of Lausanne. He means the Lausanne Treaty here. The nostalgia either of a happy childhood or the peaceful coexistence counterbalances in a way the trauma of the distant disaster and their routine. The earlier narratives were based on opposition such as earlier happy life versus the tragedy of the disaster, the refugees versus the natives, the Ladites, rich and poor, fertile Aeolian land, contrasted to the arid Greek landscape. And this fosters nostalgia. In more recent narratives by Katerina Zarokosta, Kostas Akrivos, you will see the titles on the screen, Evangelos Mavroudis and Maria Iliou, which is Maria Iliou been published last year, Mia Philia Stismini, A Friendship in Smyrna. The emphasis shifts to the cultural convergence and the coexistence of Greeks and Turks. In the 21st century, nostalgia takes a cosmopolitan turn by focusing on the port city of Smyrna, with representative examples, the novel The Witches of Smyrna, published in 2002, the documentary Smyrna, The Destruction of the Cosmopolitan City, 2012 by Maria Iliou, and the play and film My Beloved Smyrna, 2014 by Mimi Denisi. Louis de Bernier also projects the multicultural peaceful coexistence of different ethnic groups in Asia Minor in his novel Birds Without Wings, published in 2004. And now I move to the second category of text, which is more dramatic. Loss, pain, and lyricism permeate the narratives of the writers of this category, whose lives were marked by war and uprootedness. In this category, the narratives, A Prisoner of War, War Story, 1929 by Stratis Lucas, and the number 32A by Venezis stand out. And we have heard about the number from Natasha earlier on. Ducas' story is one of the shortest and most powerful accounts of the ordeal of those who were unable to escape in time across the Aegean to mainland Greece. It remains one of the most widely read stories in Greece. Acclaimed for its oral simplicity and captivating narrative qualities, it is the story of Nicholas Kozakoglou, a refugee from the Smyrna area, recorded by the author himself in the village of Stoupi, now known as New Ephesus near Katerini. Kozakoglou escaped death by pretending to be a Muslim. The story is one of survival, not heroism, hatred, or revenge. No blame is apportioned for the disaster. It is a testimony to sheer human versatility and resilience, and indirectly reveals how, although Greeks and Turks lived together on the whole peacefully in earlier times, they also remained deeply ignorant and suspicious of each other's religious practices. By presenting momentous events in deceptively simple words and avoiding descriptions, epithets, or other embellishments, the story relies on its overwhelming directness. The writer assumes the role of a mere recorder, but one can sense a conscious effort to turn the account into fiction. Ducas acts as a phonographer in a way similar to that in which his hero acts as a Muslim in order to escape death. He Hellenizes and purifies the oral account of Kozakoglou, who, being a native Turkish speaker, is heavily influenced by Turkish syntax and vocabulary. So the story is not a transcript of Kozakoglou's account, but a reworking by the writer himself. Wearing masks and switching identities, it blends the horrors of captivity subtly with the illusion of storytelling. A number of textual changes of ideological significance occur in the 1938 third edition of the novel, in which the patriotism of the captives is enhanced, while the reference to their selfishness or cowardice, indicated by their cheers for Kemal Atatürk, are omitted. Significantly, the dedication of the first and second editions The first one is dedicated to the common ordeals of the Greek and Turkish people, was changed in the third to dedicated to the common ordeals of people everywhere. This might be due to the subsequent experience of the Second World War, or could be accounted by the writer's socialist beliefs. Something similar could be said about Venezis. In the wake of the Second World War and Greek Civil War, Venezis' commitment to national community came to occupy a more central place within his novel, the number 3132A. In later editions of the novel, starting from the second edition of 1945, he softened or removed the disparaging or incriminating details of the National Greek Army and Orthodox priests. In particular, a key description of Greek reprisal operations carried out by the local Muslim populations fades from the text until only the term reprisal has been saved, shorn of every detail. By the second edition, not only are the atrocities of the Greek occupation army reduced to single abstract phrase, those carried by Muslim guerrillas left unnamed in the original become in the subsequent editions the work of a general class of people called Turks. After 1945, the trauma narrative of the number 3132A gains a new dimension, national solidarity. And to achieve this solidarity, the narrative progressively softens or silences Greek culpability. In earlier fiction on the Asia Minor disaster, the references to violence against civilians by the Greek army might be rare and limited to its retreat and not its advance. But more recent narratives, such as Panos Karnezis' novel The Maze, 2004, first published in English, reversed this trend. Karnezis challenges the view that the Asia Minor campaign constituted a liberation, not a conquest, by focusing on the effect of the defeated Greek army brigade to find its way to the shore across the Anatolian desert, and the sense of guilt for killing civilians and the beginning of the campaign. The atrocities of the Greek troops towards Turkish soldiers and civilians are also presented in Demosthenes Papamarkos' widely acclaimed stories Yak in 2014. The title Yak is in Albanitica, meaning blood, showing how the soldiers who fought in Asia Minor came back marked by the brutality of war. This shift in the representation of war is accompanied by another transition from testimonial to archival narratives. Since those who experienced the events in Asia Minor have all by now eclipsed, modern writers have turned their attention to archival research. An indicative example is the recent novel by Elias Maglinis, Το μόνο της ζωής του ταξίδι, μικρά αστεία οδηπορικό σε πόλεμο και σε ειρήνη, published last year. So the title alludes to Vizino's story, the only journey of his life. This Maglinis' narrative is a hybrid narrative, including an account of a trip to Turkey by the author himself, tracing the steps of his soldier grandfather, letters, diaries, reports, archival and photographic material, and a blending of past and present. This is not a testimony like those of Ducas and Venezis, mourning for the lost homelands, but an exploration of the archives of the past and a journey of self-knowledge. From the painful experience of the refugees, we move to the mediated trauma and the post-memories of the descendants. And two concluding points. First, it seems that the trauma of Asia Minor has produced less narratives compared to the trauma of civil war, which even in the 21st century continues to generate new narratives. The myth of the lost homelands might be promoted in different media in various ways, but in fiction has not produced comparable outputs to the civil war and its aftermath. The second point for discussion has to do with a limited number of fictional accounts on the difficulties faced by refugees in settling and living in Greece. The attention of the writers is constantly focused on the lost homelands rather than on the new one. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. I want to thank you, the British School at Athens, for the invitation, and Gonda van Steen for the organization of this panel. I will focus on two texts, on some texts that have been already mentioned in this. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now? Ah, okay, because I cannot see it.
Oh, good, Maria, go ahead.
Okay, I will focus. I will say very briefly some things about the interwar period, and then I'll move to the 1962 anniversary of the Asia Minor disaster. In both Greece and Turkey, literary discourse took on the role of the guardian of memory in a continuum with literary discourses and the oral history projects, where oral testimonies were shaped by a framework defined by literary testimonies, such as the number 13328, which has by Venezis, which has already been discussed.
Maria,
Yes?
one moment. We just got notification that we lost your screen sharing function.
Okay.
Would you mind trying it again?
Okay, of course. Can you see it now?
Yes, now we're good.
Okay, because I cannot see it, my PowerPoint for some reason. I can only see the Zoom. Okay, sorry about that. In Turkey, testimony is used to vindicate the nationalist narrative of the early republic period. In Greece, on the contrary, the cultural landscape after the defeat and the catastrophe of 1922, testimony functioned in the tradition of the World War I war books, challenging all the discourses and the institutions that promote war. I will not stay any further on the number by Venezis, which has been discussed, but I want to say that this Venezis narrative contributed to the shaping of a refugee narrative and identity based on victimization, and while the Asia Minor Greeks remained marginalized during the interwar period, and the narrative of Asia Minor catastrophe was defined by Venezuelist and anti-Venezuelist party politics, literature gave voice to Asia Minor Greeks, and Venezis became an emblematic figure during the interwar period. But in the post-war period, he attempted to distance himself from that. This interplay between journalism, literature published in the press, and oral narrative continues in the post-war period in different political circumstances. In the aftermath of the 1955 pogrom against the Constantinople Greeks and the Cyprus independence in 1960, hostility against Turkey was on the rise, and this rendered the 1962 40-year anniversary a very politicized event. Nevertheless, in the Cold War framework, Turkey was an ally, and the enemy was on the communist countries on the north. So these circumstances brought the right-wing government in a very awkward position regarding the Asia Minor catastrophe anniversary. And this rendered the anniversary a very politicized event. The government did not commemorate the anniversary in any way, and the newspapers of the right followed suit, while newspapers of the center, such as Tovima and Tanea, let me no, sorry. Το βήμα είναι τα νέα. Sorry. Published only travelogues in present-day Turkey. On the other hand, the left, and I have here a periodical of the left, επιθεώρηση τέχνης, brought the anniversary to the spotlight and attempted to connect it with a narrative of Greek history, because until then, there was not a narrative of Asia Minor catastrophe connected to this grand narrative of Greek history. And this was done in a convergence of historiography, oral narratives, and literature. Within this framework appeared three literary texts that have been already mentioned: Διδώ Σωτηρίου, Farewell Anatolia, or Ματωμένα χώματα in Greek, Φώτης Κόντογλου, Το Αϊβαλί, η πατρίδα μου, and Κοσμάς Πολίτης, Στου Χατζηφράγκου. The most emblematic writer of this anniversary, who connected the role of the Asia Minor Greek, the journalist, and the writer, was Διδώ Σωτηρίου.
Maria,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but we're still on the title page. So somehow, I'm not sure if your forwarding function is working, but right now we see your blue title page. And I know that you intend us to be on the third slide. So if you could just, we have all the time in the world. So.
Let me try to share once again.
Okay.
I don't know what is the problem. So let me. Can you see the?
Not yet.
I don't know what is the. It says go to full screen. Let me just. Now I've lost the PowerPoint. Sorry. Your browser is preventing access to your share screen. I can read here.
A solution is otherwise to quickly send the PowerPoint to Kate Smith and then give Kate just little indications when to turn the slide.
Okay, sorry.
That takes the pressure off.
Yes. Yes, sorry. Let me just email. Okay. So, Kate, I just sent it. If you have received it, I am in. Sorry, because I have to open it again. I was on the third slide. Okay. All right. So I'll just go on. As I was saying, in the 1960 anniversary, the left decided to introduce the Asia Minor catastrophe in the grand narrative of Greek history. And Διδώ Σωτηρίου, who is the writer of Ματωμένα χώματα, combined the qualities of the journalist, the Asia Minor Greek, and the writer. her novel is based on the testimony by, as we have already heard from Professor Giovas, and he is the representative of the Asia Minor experience, the Ameleta Beru in World War I, the Asia Minor campaign, the Catastrophe, and it is divided between an idealized peaceful past and the animosity between ethnicities in the Ottoman Empire. Following the Marxist interpretation of events in the framework of imperialistic antagonism, the strife between ethnicities is blamed on foreign, and that is German, intervention in the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, although atrocities on both sides are graphically described as a continuum of violence and retribution, the novel is a nostalgic reminiscence of peaceful coexistence of Greeks and Turks. And it is characteristic that it ends with the narrator's farewell to Anatolia, and to the Turk irregular soldier, the narrator killed in captivity, while the Turk was in captivity, and cursing those who are to blame for these events in both Greek and Turkish. Thus, the novel challenges nationalistic narrative and creating a new narrative about the events. And this does not have to do with interwar party politics, but the culprits are the great powers. Connecting the authenticity and not the Greek or the Turkish people. Connecting the authenticity attributed to testimony and first-person narrative with a representative protagonist and a Marxist interpretation, along with an excellent use of realistic narrative techniques, Sotiriou shaped a novel that redefined the literary narrative of Asia Minor experience. And this narrative was very successful immediately, as we can see in the, it is in the seventh slide, Kate, thank you. Sorry, but I have to change between the PowerPoint and the Zoom. No, this one, thank you. Yes, where the, no, sorry. This narrative was very successful immediately, as we can see by the title of the novel, which was adopted in the travelogue published in Tanea by another journalist very soon after the publication. It is very interesting that the novel was also very successful in Turkey, it was translated in Turkish in 1970, especially among the left. It was its circulation was prohibited during the Turkish dictatorship in 1983, but still the novel set a blueprint for the Greek and Turkish relationship in political and journalistic discourses in both countries. I will now move on to Kosmas Politis and to Hadjifragu. Can you move to the next slide, please, Kate? Thank you. Which was initially serialized in the broad interest magazine Tachydromos in '62, and you can see it here, and published in book form the next year. Kosmas Politis was brought up in Smyrna and left only days before the catastrophe, paying a large sum for that. And since his wife was of Austrian origin, he was able to return 2 years later to collect some belongings, which was a very rare privilege since Greek nationals were prohibited to return to Turkey. Although he became an established writer in the interwar period, Kosmas Politis never referred to his Asia Minor experience. After World War II and his alignment with the left, he worked more as a translator. He stopped publishing more or less. The climate was negative for him. And Stu Hadjifragu is his first novel after many years. And as he notes in the subtitle, it's a 40-year commemoration of a lost city. And this city, Smyrna, is never named. And it is presented as a multi-ethnic space where coexistence is seemingly peaceful, but there are tensions. And the novel is set in 1902, 20 years before the catastrophe, and its focus is the poor neighborhood of Hadjifrago. The novel differentiates itself from the commemorative narratives which emphasize the riches of Smyrna Greeks. And most of its characters have in-between identities that challenge nationalism. In one of the first scenes, the neighborhood Turkish policeman can speak Greek, and not only Greek, but Katharevousa Greek. And the narrator characterizes the neighborhood Orthodox priest, his compatriot, because they both were born in Larissa, present-day Greece. So the refugee is the Turkish policeman. The refugees presented in the text are not Greeks, but Muslims from the Balkans and Greece. Thus, the refugee experience is not only related to Asia Minor Greeks, but it is the result of nationalisms across the Balkans. Therefore, the discourse of victimization that is, is relativized. Unlike Ματωμένα Χώματα, this novel does not attempt to construct a grand narrative of the past. It explicitly attacks the discourses of nationalism and irredentism through the celebration of the Rum identity, as opposed to the Greeks from Greece. Professor Giovas already mentioned that the local Greeks, the Asia Minor Greeks, are differentiated from the Greeks from Greece. And the universalization of the refugee experience and the emphasis on the multi-ethnic character of Smyrna, all these are challenges to nationalism. And the text's complex techniques and multi-layered construction of space and the identities who inhabit it led to a critical acclaim from all ideological sides and aesthetic schools. Although it is not as well read as Ματωμένα Χώματα, the subversive character of its thematics and techniques could be the explanation. And the novel was also translated in Turkish in 1994. It was a period when Turkey was looking back to this coexistence with Greeks. But it was not as successful as Ματωμένα Χώματα. In recent decades, as Professor Giovas already mentioned, there is a number of bestsellers with Asia Minor thematics connected to the lost homelands nostalgia, which adopts a discourse of victimization and an orientalistic outlook in Asia Minor space, and the relevant television series and movies. At the same period, certain writers, and Professor Giovas mentioned Demosthenis Papamarkos, I would also want to add Θανάσης Βαλτινός, Συναξάρη Ανδρέα Κορδοπάτη, βιβλίο δεύτερο. It has not been translated in English. Which question the national narrative by focusing on the silenced aspects of the Asia Minor campaign, such as atrocities on civilians by the Greek army, and especially sexual violence by Greek soldiers against Turkish population. The opposite has been largely discussed in literature, but this was a taboo subject. They thus command on the ideological reading of the past from the perspective of the present. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for the delay and the problems with the PowerPoint.
It worked out beautifully. Thank you all. Thank you to all of our speakers. And I would now first like to open the discussion among our speakers and encourage questions to the panelists, from one panelist to the other, and let the connections between the various talks emerge. Who wants to go first? Dimitri?
Yeah, can I ask Natasha, but also this applies to Maria as well as to the audience, is that I can see from your figures the circulation of numeral of the number, that in the 1950s the sales shoot up to 150,000 copies. Is that related to the events in Istanbul in the mid-1950s? Because it's interesting to compare how the circulation of these novels. I mean, we know that Farewell Anatolia is was until the 1970s the most popular novel in Greece. And also Life in the Tomb by Miridilis was also popular. I have done some research about Stratis Doukas, and I can see that the novel was very popular in Cyprus after the Turkish invasion in 1974. So you could see that the circulation of the novel, of these novels, are related to the events, the subsequent events. And I don't know whether you have got any details, any figures to compare Venezi's sales with Miridilis and others.
No, I don't have any. Can you see me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I don't have any more details. This was actually in 1959 that the circulation rose up. Perhaps it has to do with the situation between, the political situation between Greece and Turkey, but unfortunately I don't have any other information about it. No.
If I can add something, 1952 edition, I think I'm sure that was connected with the 30-year anniversary also of the event, which was not really celebrated. I mean, the 40-year anniversary became a big event, but the 30-year anniversary was immediately after the Civil War and in a very polarized situation politically. But I'm sure that it was in a way relaunched, let's say, because of the anniversary. But I'm also sure that the Cyprus events and the Asia Minor, the Constantinople pogrom also played a role in that.
Yeah, I think that this is an area that needs more research, although it's very difficult to establish figures, because another aspect one can explore is whether Venezia was trying to become a member of the Academy of Athens, and this also played a role. I mean, we know that this happened with Miridilis, and that happened with Venezia. So the circulation of these novels until the 1970s and 1980s, it's very interesting to compare, to see the popularity as well as the trends, because the new editions also are accompanied by changes to the text itself.
Yes, I have actually touched upon the subject of the changes to the text to become more, national, and they tone down the atrocities committed by us, while at the very first editions, and this happens with Miridilis too, they speak out in a way that is, makes you feel uncomfortable sometimes with the way they narrate and the language they use, which is I wouldn't call it vernacular demotic. It's quite, Magliari demotiki, and this also changes. And with this, the whole character of the the idea changes as well.
Maria?
Yes, I would like to. I recently read Natasha Lemos's PhD thesis, and there is a lot of very interesting material because I don't speak Turkish, so it is very interesting. This comparison you are making. What I wanted to say is that. This anti-national use of testimony is very. It is even more political on the part of Venezis and Mirivilis. If you think that, especially the atrocities of both the Turkish and the Greek army had been a very heated issue throughout the campaign, you know, throughout and there were all these international committees that employed testimonies. And so, and you know what, you know, the whole Toynbee scandal with King's College, etc. So it is very, a very, let's say, sorry, anti-nationalist or very provocative choice on the side of Mirivilis and Venezis to talk about these atrocities, because Greece was on the diplomatic corner due to this issue.
Yes.
And on the and it of course it has to do with the pacifist and in Turkey it's the opposite. Testimony works in a very different way, I think.
First of all, I think that the issue with the atrocities in literature at the earlier stages have to do also with, you know, whose side you are with. And because the war was lost during the royalist period, it was easy for them to say about the atrocities because the blame goes on to the royalists. So that might be one factor, political factor. In Turkey, it's, you know, at the early stages, the literature actually is first accounts, not so much by people who participated as soldiers in the war, but they were there, you know, to witness what was going on. And there were books published as early as 1922 with accounting for the atrocities committed by the Greek side as actually a response to other books which had been published, like Konstantinos Faltaitis' book in 1921 about the atrocities of the Turks with the title Avti in Turkey, These Are the Turks. So, yeah.
Good. Well, if I may immediately build on that with a question by David Holton, who asks, what would explain the very recent interest of novelists in Asia Minor? Any reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, we need to link that, first of all, to the debate about the genocide, the Pontic genocide. During the last 20 years or so, there was a discussion about genocide and then also narratives and testimonies about Pontic Greeks or Pontians. They were very, very, very popular. And also the revival now is not so much focused on Asia Minor itself, but particularly on Smyrna as a cosmopolitan city. And I think the kind of narratives focus on cities rather than on the whole area. And the Asia Minor also becomes a media event. I mean, we have got plays, we have got films, we have got exhibitions. I mean, Maria Iliou, for example, started this exhibition about Smyrna and then turned into a novel. So it's not just limited to fiction, but it's a broader media event.
Yeah. If I may say, I think also that the constant status of refugees and the constant reminders of the fate of refugees coming from Asia Minor must have something to do with it as well.
Yes,
But Natasha, you were going to say?
I think that when we refer to, in all these books, when there is reference to the cosmopolitanism character of the cities, like Smyrna, I think that the main stress is not so much on cosmopolitanism, but the Greekness of the cities. That they are, the most important element in the city. And what I find is that the Turks are almost non-existent from there. So I think this is something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it can work both ways, as a cosmopolitan city as well as a Greek city.
Yeah, I mean the Turks sometimes are either non-existent or they are referred to as just the lower classes, and they ignore that they were actually there was upper classes among the Turks as well. They were not only people who did, who were middle class or village peasants or
Maria?
Also, the influx of refugees from Turkey from 2015 onwards played a role. I mean, this image of the three elderly ladies in Mytilene, they said that we experienced the status of a refugee, and therefore were helping those who were coming from the other shore. So it's you could see that the refugee crisis played a role, but just it's one aspect, not the entire. It's not the main reason for that.
Maria, did you want to add to this?
Yes, I wanted to say that this interest in Asia Minor is earlier than 2015. I mean that Alexander Kirkotroev, I think, I don't remember the title of his article, has written about how since the 1980s there is this interest in the lost homelands, Hamenes Patrides, and I think there are two trends. There is this more nationalistic trend of this nostalgia. It is not irredentism, but there is this nostalgia of past glories or whatever, which silences all the dark aspects of how the refugees were treated when they arrived in Greece, and all the violence of the atrocities on the part of the Greek army, etc. And then there is this more international, and this in the representation of cities in this case is that they are Greek cities. And I think the other trend is a more, let's say, internationalist, saying that, okay, this was a more cosmopolitan, but in a nostalgia that is the nostalgia of a more open horizons, let's say. I don't know. And there, of course, the literary texts belong, Professor Diovas has already spoken about these two trends, but it is political. It's not only literary, the interest in this, the interest in Asia Minor, I think. And I think that these two trends converge in the let's say, history book war regarding the book of Ragus, Repusi, I don't know if you are aware of that, which in 2002.
Yeah.
And if I may, Matomena Homata was included in that because when the book was withdrawn because of there was this big reaction to its narrative of exactly the Asia Minor catastrophe. Karamanlis, who was in government then, proposed matomena chomata to be given out in the schools, so as to a literary text would somehow cover the historical narrative.
Excellent. I also think that visual images have a lot to do with it. Think of what movies can do, like, smells, politiki cuisine, literature and cuisine coming together as in Loxandra. I think there is tapping again in that rich vein of nostalgia. There is, somebody put a question in the chat, but I'll still read it. Is the memory of Asia Minor then a memory of space / place or an era, time? And I would say that one doesn't exclude the other necessarily. Any other reflections?
If we speak about literature, I think it's more of a space, I would say. More of the texts we examined, or the nostalgic texts at least, recreate space more than an era, I think.
Natasha and Dimitri?
Imaginary homeland. But it's interesting that we don't have, and that's why I made the point at the end, we don't have any novels or any narratives about the refugee experience, how they have been treated in Greece. I mean, when they came, the refugees in Greece, they were called baptized with yogurt because they were using yogurt in the cuisine. And although we have got studies on the refugee experience, starting with René Hirschhorn on her study, the Catastrophe, or Bruce Clark, Twice Strangers. We don't have narratives about the experience of the refugees in Greece. I mean, we have got every Greek city, major Greek city, has got a district named Smyrna, but then how they settled here, or their descendants. I mean, always it's about the lost homeland, the imaginary homelands, but not about the new homeland. And this is quite interesting.
But what about Argo? There are mentions, you know, of the settling or the unsettling, rather, the refugees in Athens, at least at the earlier stages.
Yes, but there, I mean, Theotokos also moved to Athens before, just before.
Well, he was not a refugee as per se.
Yes.
Yeah. Or Tatiana Stavros, οι πρώτες ρίζες.
Yeah, but I mean, in the recent years, in the last 3 or 4 decades.
Well, actually, Venedig had spotted the problem, but there's no how after so many years there is no literature collectively about the refugees, with the exception of Tatiana Stavros' which is about the settling of refugees in Thessaloniki. Yeah.
Then I had a smaller question for Natasha. If you could please elaborate on the Turkish meanings of Anadolu, Anatolia, and where it falls short of the Greek meanings.
Yes, I think perhaps I did not make myself understood properly. I said that the meaning of Anatolia in Greek is Krebu, because we have Anatolia as the east, Anatolia as the dawn, and Anatolia as Anatolia. In Turkish, there is no such Krebu meaning. Anadolu, which is borrowed obviously from Greek Anatolia, refers only to a geographical area, which is the west of the Aegean coast, which is what corresponds to parts of what we call Asia Minor. So while Venezis uses this artful phrasing, uses Anatolia both as the dawn and Anatolia, in Turkish, this cannot be it cannot be used in such nuanced way. So the translator uses Anadolu, but another translator could have used the word dawn, which is east more than Anadolu. I don't know if I make myself clear, but Anadoli, Anadolu, which a translator of the present copy uses, is only refers only to the geographical area and nothing else.
Okay.
Unlike the Greek Anatoly.
And then I have a question from Joanna Hislop, who says, is it possible that the narratives did not deal with the present refugee situation because the event of the catastrophe itself had not been recognized? But I think lack of recognition doesn't necessarily stop people from writing about it. I'm thinking of the Armenian genocide, for instance. One can still write about the trauma, even if the genocide hasn't gotten recognition from all parties, perhaps even as an incentive to have that recognition come through. So I'm not exactly sure. Maybe Joanna, I apologize if I were not to understand the question very well, but feel free to elaborate.
If I can say something, I don't know if she means the 1922 catastrophe or the genocide of the Pontic Greeks, but literature played a very crucial role in recognizing, as I said, and giving a voice to refugees. And at the moment, there are many, many bestseller novels about the Pontic Greek experience. I think there is all this discussion about the genocide. Some writers, especially bestseller writers, tap on that, and they write a lot about it. Obviously, it sells.
Okay. I also have a question that this has more of an archival component. So the Center for Asia Minor Studies has, of course, the testimonies of people coming from the population exchange. The question is to what extent these oral testimonies taken down on paper and therefore archival records have influenced the shaping of literature. And I want to broaden that a little bit by questioning, this is a personal question now, the archive altogether. Of course, the transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish nationalist state is also the tradition of the demarcation line, the cutoff of an alphabet that's discontinued and not necessarily understood by Turks of recent generations. So that leaves a whole archive unexplored. So what kind of treasures are out there that could feed into literature, and to what extent have they been utilized? That's kind of the broader question. And I want to direct it especially to Dimitri and Natasha, with an emphasis then also on the switch from Arabic to Latin script.
If one is to talk about the Ottoman archives, of course, with the alphabet change, a lot of the archival material was cut off, and people are completely unaware of the publications which were taking. Can you hear me? Which were taking place no? Yes, which were taking place during the war, and there was an abundance of publications, not only in support of Mustafa Kemal's resistance movement, which fed their national narrative, but also with the voices which were against it. But now gradually this changes because there are more and more people who start learning Ottoman, and they have access to the archives, and there is a lot, to be revealed from them. And definitely is going to be it's very important, because there are works which were left into, oblivion until very recently. But the same happens for different reasons with some works in Greece, in Greek literature. For example, Socrates Procopius, Some Ψέματα και σαν αλήθεια of 1928, which does not deal with Smyrna or any cosmopolitan city, but with Ushak in deeper Anatolia, never got the attention it ought to have. I don't know if Dimitris wants to add something.
I mentioned the novel by Elias Manglinis, which uses quite a lot of archival material, photographic material, and also is accompanied by photographs, because he travels to Turkey to trace the steps of his grandfather. But also he's using quite a lot of family archival material, and also from other sources. And you could see that the Center for Asia Minor Studies has got a rich archive, and now, not in the area of literature, but in the area of historiography, you could see that there is emphasis not only on refugees, but also on the experiences of the soldiers. And we have got a number of studies which focus on the experience of the soldiers who participated in the Asia Minor campaign. Mm-hmm. You could see that there are different kinds of testimonies, not only from ordinary people, but also from the soldiers. And this is the writers who take advantage of it.
Can I?
Sure.
Yeah, can I make another point? There were actually there were a number, I don't know how many, but a good number of short novels were published by refugees in Turkey. They were about the refugees, which is a subject completely absent from the official literary canon in Turkey. And these will gradually are starting coming to the fore, and this will change the image of the Turkish literature of that time. For example, there is a very short type of novel about a refugee from Bulgaria. And other novels, but they are in Ottoman Turkish, and they haven't been transliterated, and very difficult, of course, to find. But I have found one in the British Library, in fact. Mm-hmm. So yes, and I'm working on it. Because, of course, the national narrative in Turkey that wants, a new Western national modern state, which has purely Turkish with no other elements. Anatolia has no other ethnicities, no Christians, nobody else except for the Turks. So they don't really want newcomers from other parts of the Ottoman Empire.
Johanna Hislop returned to her question to also explain that in her family, the silence around the Smyrna disaster kind of, in a way, lasted for a generation, and it took the next generation to start becoming interested again and seek out the literature and the testimonies.
Actually, yes, people sometimes want to forget, or they don't want to talk about these things. There was somebody, a researcher once, and I have witnessed this, who approached a person from Asia Minor, a very old person from Asia Minor, who was very reluctant to give any information. So the researcher resisted, and she said, "But don't you want to remember?" And he said to her, "But look, my dear girl, 80 years I'm trying to forget. I don't want to remember." So, one doesn't know how sensitive people were who had witnessed the events, these terrible events, really.
And, also a desire to let their children grow up without that shadow over their heads. Yeah. Maria, you're muted in the meantime.
Of course, this is a discussion that is connected to the Holocaust. I mean, there is a very, very large bibliography on that. But I wanted to say that in Stu Hadjifragu, the novel I discussed earlier, Kosmas Politis thematizes the reluctance to remember, because there is this central chapter where he thematizes this interview, with the witness and the researcher, where the witness resists and does not want to remember. And in the end, he remembers the more personal and not the historical, and the personal is more traumatic in a way also. So this is thematized also in literature, this reluctance to remember. And of course, oral history theory, etc., has discussed it in extent.
Well,
I just wanted to say something. I want to go back to a previous question by an anonymous attendee about the Center for Asia and Minor Studies. It is well known that Ilias Venezis was involved in that, and in a way, Venezis shaped. Not only Venezis, but Merlier also, in a way, shaped their expectations of testimonies based on literary testimonies, I think. That was the best they could have, based on the testimonies from the international committees. I mean, the two models of testimony they were after were the testimonies from the international committees that they had worked on the atrocities, and on literary testimonies. And I think it is not by coincidence that Venezis becomes the editor for so many years, although...
Gave up eventually. He gave up at some point because...
Yes, he gave up, but and it was also a matter of health, I think. But I think that he played the role in shaping the questionnaires and the layout of the testimonies, how their preference for written testimonies rather than for recorded testimonies or real oral testimonies. I think that all these have to do with the literary discourse in a way.
For anybody who wants to read more about the shaping of that archive to certain expectations, I think Penelope Papalias's chapter on that particular archive is really quite good and quite an eye-opener, because we think of an archive as more objective until then you read how certain programmatic lines were handed down to the interviewers. And it's about...
And the correspondence between Merlier and Venezis has very recently been published, and that shows how this interaction went. And so,
absolutely.
And of course, we have also the testimonies by Eli Papadimitriou in Oslo, which are very important.
Yeah. Well, we come close to closing time now, and I want to give each one of our speakers an opportunity to leave us with a final thought before we say our final thank yous and greet and wish our audience a good night. Natasha, you get to start.
As I'm dealing with Turkish literature of the same on the same subject, one point is that although most of the canonical works from Greek literature have been translated into Turkish, I don't know how big the circulation is, but still they are the translations. None of the literature from the War of Independence, as it is known in Turkey, has been translated into Greek, and I think this is something that has it should be done, because then makes you look at things from all different points of view. Although, of course, literature is not a source for history, it helps. And also a point that Maria made me think about, Politis, who refers to refugees in Hadjifrangou, he refers to the refugees from Muslim refugees from mainland Greece. One thing that does not exist in Turkish literature is the refugees. Perhaps,
yes,
with the translations of Hadjifrangou into Turkish readers become more alert about the subject, so it works mutually to understand each other through literature.
That's a big message. Thank you, Natasha. Dimitri.
Yeah, I think the commemoration goes on, and this year is the 100th, the anniversary of the Lausanne Treaty, and perhaps this anniversary will help us to focus more on the refugee experience and the exchange of populations. I mean, looking to the Muslims from Crete moving to Turkey and other exchanges. So perhaps this anniversary will help us to shift the focus from the lost homelands to the refugee experience.
Yeah, and the engineering of refugee populations and where you send them and what you allow to do them and those you don't talk about and all of it. Yeah, Maria.
What I wanted to say is that I thought that the Asia Minor experience was somewhat, you know, reached the point, but we see that it's still, there are still books published and there is a lot of interest still on that. And the books published are not only the nostalgic ones, but there are interesting approaches. And that seems that it shows that it is still relevant very much, and it's for different approaches, and I think that is very hopeful.
Excellent. Well, on this note then, and with our work cut out for us, I want to thank our panelists again. You did a marvelous job, and I think it came together beautifully. And I think also the two panels start talking to each other quite nicely. I want to thank my wonderful co-hosts, the British School at Athens and Aiora Press, and of course the inimitable Kate Smith, who is the magical wizard behind the scene. And of course, all of you in the audience for hearing us out, asking these wonderful questions. The audience is present and audience in the future, since this session is recorded. Thank you and have a great night.